Last week, several important international studies relating to energy and climate were published. The one I want to deal with today is the Emissions Gap Report from UNEP, the UN Environmental Programme, which essentially talks about what the sink side of nature is telling us. One of the other reports is from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and that talks about the source side, but I'll leave that for another time. Scientifically, sinks can mean different specific things, but in this case it means things that absorb greenhouse gases, or GHGs, particularly CO2. And sources means things like fossil fuels, which emit GHGs when burned. The headline quote from the Emissions Gap Report is that there is now no credible way to stay within the 1.5 C, or centigrade, as I like to say, Celsius limit. Although it doesn't always explicitly say it in the UNEP report, these temperature targets usually refer to end of the century. We're already seeing widespread and fatal disruption from a 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature since the 19th century, so it seems reasonable to say that any increase on this will both bring a greater quantity of devastating events and quite likely a qualitative worsening in their ferocity and capacity for damage and death. To start with, I'll use a very good Guardian article by Damien Carrington to highlight some of the main points. Then I'll look at the actual report itself, or at least the executive summary, which is still 12 pages long. This is the Guardian report, and I'm going to Climate Crisis, UN finds no credible pathway to 1.5 C in place. Failure to cut carbon emissions means rapid transformation of societies is only option to limit impacts, report says. This is the key part. Rapid transformation of societies. Only option. We'll get to that in a few minutes. To put it very briefly, if current short-term pledges, which means those to be delivered by 2030, are implemented, we'll still see, by the end of the century, a 2.8 C rise. If 2050 net zero pledges, which are so-called long-term pledges, are met, that would bring it down to a 1.8 degrees C rise. But, says the report, these efforts are all hopelessly off track and moving at a glacial pace. And since COP26 countries were supposed to increase their pledges, but only a couple of dozen have done so, and even this only amounts to just 1% extra cut in emissions, about half a gigaton of carbon dioxide, when the total emissions cut needed by 2030 is 45%. Because of this, the article says, recapitulating the report, failure to cut carbon emissions means rapid transformation of societies. It's the only option to limit impacts. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says we must close the emissions gap before climate catastrophe closes in on us. Professor David King, former UK Chief Scientific Advisor, says no one is doing anywhere near enough. So I think this is fairly clear that we're not on the right track. In words echoed in her foreword to the report, which we'll get to in a minute, Inge Anderson, the executive director of the UNEP, says, "We had our chance to make incremental changes, but that time is over. Only a root and branch transformation of our economies and societies can save us from an accelerating climate disaster." She says it is almost impossible now, however, but we must still try because every fraction of a degree matters. Well, there are 11 sections in the summary, the executive summary of the report, and I want to mention some of the major points. The thing that really interests me is what is meant by this societal transformation, this root and branch change. Because a mountain of evidence shows that our current societal system is what is responsible for destroying the planet and its extraordinary diversity of life at a horrifying speed. So something pretty massive obviously needs to change, and quickly. So my big question is, does the report at least offer some answers on a scale of quantity and quality that might give us and the planet a chance? As this isn't a suspense movie, I'll tell you now that I think the answer is mostly no. But in order to get closer to a yes, I think it is worth considering what the report does offer and why it will probably fall short. So now on to the report itself. This, as you can see, is the foreword by Inge Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. And I've given you some quotes already from what she's said. I'll just read some bits that I've highlighted here. And still, as UNEP's Emissions Gap Report 2022 shows, nations procrastinate. They are putting off till tomorrow in the literal meaning of the Latin. Since COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, new and updated nationally determined contributions, these are NDCs, which the countries have to come up with, have barely impacted the temperatures we can expect to see at the end of this century. She says, in the best case scenario, full implementation of conditional NDCs, these are slightly tougher than the unconditional ones, plus additional net zero commitments point to a 1.8 degree rise. However, this scenario is currently not credible. So far she's pretty well saying everything is not credible. We're nowhere near on track. She goes on, in this section here, a stepwise approach is no longer an option. We need system-wide transformation. This report tells us how to go about such a transformation. And hence my question, does it really? It looks at how to reform financial systems so that these urgent transformations can be adequately financed. It looks in depth at the changes needed in electricity supply, industry, transport, buildings and food systems. It also looks at how to reform financial systems so that these urgent transformations can be adequately financed. And one last bit from here. She says, we have missed the opportunity to invest in a low-carbon recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we are in danger of missing the opportunity to boost clean and efficient energy as a response to the energy crisis. Now, on to the executive summary of the closing window. The first item is a general testimony to the inadequate action on the climate crisis and the need for a transformation. This is the 13th edition of the Emissions Gap Report, and once again they highlight how inadequate the action has been and how limited the progress is in reducing the immense emissions gap for 2030. Farther down, global GHG emissions in 2030 based on current policies are estimated at 58 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent. That's GTCO2e. As these headline findings illustrate, incremental change is no longer an option. We need broad-based, economy-wide transformations to avoid closing the window of opportunity of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 C. The climate crisis is part of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution and biodiversity loss. This year, the world is witnessing compounding energy, food and cost of living crises exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, all of which are causing immense human suffering. Then suggests that GHG emissions could set a new record for last year. It does say that the rate of growth of emissions has slowed compared with the previous decade, but as they're getting larger and larger, that slowing is clearly not enough. Also points out that GHG emissions are uneven across regions and countries. It mentions the top 7 emitters, starting with China, which you can see down here is by far the largest, followed by the USA. India and the EU are pretty large. And it also looks at the per capita emissions, of which USA is one of the top. It's not the highest, but it is very high. USA in this chart is the top. There are even higher per capita ones, but it's pretty bad. Russian Federation also bad. China is now high per capita GHG emitter. Brazil too. The EU is a bit lower. India considerably lower, but of course there are a lot of Indians, so it all has to be multiplied out. It mentions that despite the call to countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets, little progress has been made, highly inadequate. G20 members are far behind in delivering on their mitigation commitments. This is a chart which gives you some idea of where things are. This is us about now. Actually, this is the fall during COVID, so we're probably somewhere like this. Almost back where we were in 2019. And on current policy scenarios, we're going to get to here by 2030, which is 58 gigatons, so not down at all, but up. If some of these NDCs are applied, the unconditional ones, this is the nationally determined contributions, we'll get to here, which is about where we were in 2019. And if the stronger conditional ones are in, we'll actually go down a little bit, but not very much. It's really nothing at all. To get down into the 2C range, you can see there's got to be quite a drop here. Notice, by the way, this isn't 0, this is 20, so just worth being aware of. And for the 1.8 degree C range, even more. So on to concretely what is supposed to be happening. Well, transformation towards zero GHG emissions in the sectors of electricity, supply, industry, transportation and buildings is underway. But the point is, it's going very slowly. Of these 4 sectors, electricity supply is the most advanced, as the costs of renewable electricity have reduced dramatically. This, it has to be said, whilst it's a lot of work, it's the easiest one in the sense that the consumer just doesn't really notice any difference. At least as long as the gas price stays low. That's a recent phenomenon. But by and large, the consumer makes absolutely no change in their behaviour whatsoever. So this is the easy one. The UNEP report says we have to avoid locking in new fossil fuel intensive infrastructure. Some have also said putting forward any new oil and gas projects, but that's clearly ludicrous, because if you look at the energy press, there's oil and gas projects going ahead at a rate of knots all over the place. And it's highly likely, with that going on, that there will be lots of more fuel intensive infrastructure. They also say, and they say this in various places, that there need to be market structures and plans for a just transformation. But I want to highlight this market structures. And they do also want to promote behavioural change to sustain and deepen reductions to reach zero emissions. Now on this page, it shows at a glance which direction countries are going in. You can see Argentina here is pretty much flat. Australia, despite what one might think, is apparently on a downward path towards a target here in 2050. Brazil, pretty much flat. The election of Lula, the confirmation of that today, may see this change, but at the moment it's barely going down. Canada, again, despite the tar sands, is heading towards its 2050 target. China, on the other hand, is resolutely going up. EU is going down. India going up even faster than China. Indonesia, a bit like Brazil, barely going down. Japan going down. Korea, Russian Federation going up. There seem to be a bunch of China, India, Russian Federation all going up pretty fast in the wrong direction. I can also add in Turkey there. UK going down as well, relatively small player. US as well, heading towards their target. Many of these somehow seem hard to believe. I'm not disputing them, but given what's going on in the news, it seems a bit mind-boggling. Then this table shows us in 4 columns of the 4 areas that are being targeted, many of the things that need to happen. And one of them is remove fossil fuel subsidies in a socially acceptable manner. I'm not quite sure how that can happen. Adapt market rules of electricity system for high shares of renewables. And you can see that there's a whole lot of things that need to happen here. Citizens, it says at the bottom, need to purchase or should purchase 100% renewable electricity, but that's not really possible, and in many places, it's possibly everywhere, it's very hard to tell that it's 100% renewable unless you've got your own solar panels or your own wind turbine. In the industry column, for the citizen, we need to consume sustainably. How on earth we're supposed to know what sustainable is? I'm going to highlight that, although it's spilled over a bit. And we're supposed to lobby as well. Given the crackdown in this country, the UK, on protesting, Not quite the same thing as lobbying, but anyway, it's in the same category, I suggest. Given those things, that's not really going to be encouraged. And in terms of transportation, citizens, we need to adopt active mobility practices. I think that means, in fact I know that means bicycling and walking. That's an interesting way to put it. Try to use public transportation. Well, good luck around where I live. The buses are few and far between, and so are the trains, as well as very expensive. Use zero emissions vehicles. They're pretty expensive, except for bicycles. Even those are quite pricey compared with what they used to be. Avoid long-haul flights. The table here, which I won't go through, also gives actions for national governments, international cooperation, businesses, and so forth. Then for buildings, at the citizen level, retrofit for improved carbon footprint. That can cost a lot of money. Tenants need to challenge landlords. Well, good luck with that one. Probably just get kicked out. And you need to adopt energy-saving behaviour, like switching off lights which just aren't needed, especially exterior ones, but also lights in buildings, offices, which are left on all over the place to an extraordinary extent. I just don't really see anything on this page which suggests to me that there is going to be a root and branch transformation. And one of the reasons why I say that, all these things basically assume the same system, the same market-based, free market-based, frankly, neoliberal, neoclassical economic system. That is what's caused us to be in this disastrous situation. And it's not at all clear that it can be reformed. It certainly isn't being. And a real root and branch transformation would look at a different kind of economic system, one that had a lot less emphasis on free markets, but that is not what's being offered. Separate from these 4 items of electricity, industry, transportation and buildings, there is mention of the food system, which accounts for 1/3 of all emissions, not just carbon dioxide, there's a lot of methane in there as well. And this is one of the big ones that ordinary people can do something about. They say projections indicate that food system emissions could reach 30 gigatons per year by 2050, which is a very large rise. It's almost double. So you can see it's very much, they're projecting it to go in the wrong direction. Required transformations include shifting diets, protecting natural ecosystems, improving food production, and decarbonising the food value chain. That is a huge ask. Of all the big asks, it's the one which on the one hand seems the most possible, but it also is going to encounter an enormous amount of resistance from consumers, I suspect. Transforming food systems is not only important for addressing climate change and environmental degradation, but also essential for ensuring healthy diets and food security for all. In other words, we won't get so many ghastly diseases, and food security just means that you actually have enough to eat. And it mentions here less loss and waste, these things here, moving to flexitarian diets, pescatarian diets, which are more fish, but the state of fish is pretty bad, and the one which is going to make the largest difference, which is moving to vegetarian and vegan diets. Sorry about that, it's running over a little bit. Basically plant-based. The more that people can move to plant-based diets, the bigger the difference. And you can see these demand-side changes are going to make the biggest difference in the food chain. Doesn't mean that the other things shouldn't be attempted, but this is very big. This is something that consumers, otherwise known as people who eat, could push for really hard. There are signs of change, but it's not going very fast, and there are also signs that heavy meat eating is very deeply embedded in at least the Western diet and people's way of acting and behaving. So it's not going to be easy. Finally, they talk about the realignment of the financial system, which is a critical enabler of the transformations needed. They talk about, to date, most financial actors have shown limited action on climate change mitigation because of short-term interests and conflicting objectives, and because climate risks are not adequately recognized. Well, they talk about increasing the efficiency of financial markets, introducing carbon pricing. Well, there is already some carbon pricing. They mention here that there's a global average of about $6 per ton of carbon, but they say it needs to be more than 10 times this. The IMF suggests a global average price of $75 per ton is required by 2030. That is a pretty huge increase. They also talk about nudge financial behavior because of deep information asymmetry, risk aversion and herd behavior, all of which result in inefficient choices. They again talk about creating markets, that public policy action can remove existing market distortions and accelerate new product markets for low carbon technology. And they also talk about mobilizing central banks. It seems to be most central banks are just mobilized towards dealing with the current financial crisis. I'm not sure how much available brain space they have for the kinds of transformations that the UN is talking about. There's a helpful graphic here which shows the kind of increases in financial flows that are needed, and many of them center on at least 5, or somewhere in the middle is 5. So in terms of energy efficiency, we need 2 to 7 times the amount of investment or yearly flow of capital. These are all 5 in the middle, seem like this, some roughly in the middle, or 5 at the upper end, but very few of them, here's one, are much less than 5. And some of them, like for instance agriculture, forestry and other land use, which means deforestation usually, requiring somewhere between 10 and 30 times the amount of investment. So that's interesting in the light of what was being said about the food system transformations needed and how important that is. And we can see the same thing down here. Here in Eastern Europe and West Central Asia, up to 15 times the amount of capital. Africa, 12 times. Middle East, 28 times at the upper limit. So this sounds like a huge ask. And again, it's still using the same method, the same financial investment methods that we've already had. Doesn't speak, I'm not saying that it's not anywhere in the report, but there isn't much heavy emphasis on governments needing to invest. It seems to me, unless I've missed something, that this is mainly about trying to get the markets to do it. And so this is one of the reasons why I think this is just not going to work. I think it's fair to say it hasn't worked up till now. UNEP might say, well, it hasn't really been tried. Well, okay, maybe it hasn't been tried, or it's been not being tried enough. It's not working, and what makes them think that it is going to be tried? And as I say, I don't think it will work. There's just too much resistance. There's going to be too much cheating. The consumer, who in many countries is about 80% of the economy, the consumer has huge resistance to this. So this is why I think that overall this does not represent a blueprint for root and branch transformation. This is, to me, ironically, despite what Inge Anderson said, this seems to me like either incremental or trying to get a system which has caused the destruction to somehow reform itself and start repairing and healing the system that it's done so much damage to. I just don't think it's going to happen. And we actually need to think of something else which actually represents a true transformation of the socio-economic system.